Hello everyone. As we were finishing the editing for this week's episode, we heard the news about the deadly mass shooting in Christchurch, New Zealand. A white supremacist, a neo-Nazi, went to 2 mosques and opened fire, killing an as yet unknown number of victims. He live-streamed his attack on Facebook, and at the start of the video said, "Subscribe to PewDiePie." He wore tactical gear emblazoned with an esoteric Nazi symbol known as a Schwarzsonne, and used an AR-15 emblazoned with racist graffiti, including references to the 14 words. He also posted a racist manifesto on 8chan. This attack is the natural result of the right-wing radicalization surging across the globe. Fascists and reactionaries are emboldened like never before to put their evil ideology into action. Every right-wing pundit who has spread racist canards, every tech platform that has tolerated fascist groups and content, and every self-satisfied liberal who has stood on free speech to defend the right of neo-Nazis to spread their propaganda bears direct responsibility for this atrocity. Our hearts go out to the victims of this senseless attack, to their families, and to the Muslim community of New Zealand. The Socialist Rifle Association will be starting a donation fund to contribute to the families destroyed by this terrorist. Please check our social media in the coming days for more details. We have nothing else to offer but our solidarity. Hello and welcome to the SRA podcast. This is your host, Faye, and your co-host, Austin.
Hello. Some of you may have noticed that we appeared on the BBC recently in a little documentary on American gun ownership amongst those on the left.
Yes, America's least likely gun owners. It was a pretty interesting experience, my first exposure on international television. A little bit disappointing considering that we did a 2-hour interview with the reporter and shot guns on camera for about 3 hours, and it all got boiled down to about a 5-minute documentary. We were expecting something in the range of 10 or 20 minutes based on what they told us.
Yeah, that's seems to kind of be the way of things in media. Things kind of get boiled down to the smallest talking points. I mean, ours especially kind of got reduced a bit, I suppose you could say.
Yeah, so it's sort of interesting. The first conversation that I had with the reporter when she came to Los Angeles and we sat down to do the interview before the camera started rolling was we had a discussion about media bias because I had a copy of Society of the Spectacle with me, and she asked me what it was about. And so I sort of discussed the interplay between the media and ideology and capital interests, and she was actually somewhat offended at the, conception that there might be some sort of inherent bias to any large media corporation. She sort of implied that because the BBC is government funded, that there's no way that it could have any ideological predisposition. Well, as things turn out, this 5-minute video managed to pack in quite a lot of ideology in a very short period of time.
Yeah, definitely true. I was kind of struck by the, you could kind of see with some of the editing that they did that there was kind of an implication that SRA is almost like a perfect mirror image of right-wing extremism, that we're just as bad. They even took some statements a bit out of context and kind of painted this picture of us being the left wing's version of a Proud Boy or a right wing terrorist in the making or something along those lines.
It's certainly nothing that we didn't expect given the BBC and liberal media in general and how they perceive groups like the SRA. And I don't want it to seem like we're railing against the Beebs, like they're so dishonest, we hate them, blah, blah, blah. No, it's just liberal media doing what liberal media does. The only thing I'm sort of upset about is just that they managed to take my description of how I came to socialist positions and cut out an entire 2 minutes of me speaking so that it sounds like it goes straight from 2016 election to I need to take a more radical view. That was an interesting edit. That was a bit more aggressive than I expected of them. But again, on the whole, this is just what media does, and you can't really expect any better of them. Especially because of this sort of, pathological obsession that liberals, especially media liberals, have with viewing all issues as having two equal and opposite sides. Because the right wing has violent extremists, that must mean that the left has violent extremists too, and here's some leftists with guns. I guess we'll just have to make do with what we've got.
And you can see why they arrive at that conclusion, given the incredibly large amounts of left-wing extremists we've seen, like bomb clinics and, shoot up shopping malls and stuff like that.
Oh, yeah, something like that happens almost every week, Yeah, I think the Weather Underground is still around and kicking, It's not like the FBI shut them down 30 years ago.
Yeah, no, but in all seriousness, though, like it does seem to be a fairly conscious effort, and you could tell that it was a fairly conscious effort in this instance, as it often is for media centrists who want to make us seem like we're too extreme, like we're an extreme answer, and that we're just as reactionary in some ways as the right wing is. And I think that this is kind of portrayed really clearly in this story recently of the Coast Guard officer who got caught with all these illegal weapons and, stockpiling all these guns and all that kind of stuff.
Yes, this was a story that we were going to talk about on the last episode, but we sort of ran out of time and the conversation flowed naturally into our discussion about mental health and suicide, so we didn't cover it then. But it's important to note this actual Coast Guard lieutenant, a commissioned officer of the U.S. military, being a right-wing extremist, a white supremacist, planning terrorist attacks against left-wing figures, including the Democratic Socialists of America. Now, granted, I don't think that he necessarily knew what the Democratic Socialists of America, because then I don't think that he would necessarily actually have bothered putting DSA on the list. I don't think they're quite as scary as they're maybe portrayed on Fox News. But Christopher Hassan is an example of an actual far-right extremist terrorist planning a mass murder against people whom he politically disagrees with. And he wasn't the only example of this in the past couple of years. In fact, according to the Anti-Defamation League, in 2018 there were 15 extremist terrorist attacks, and all 50 of them were committed by extreme right-wing and white supremacist actors, some of them part of organized groups such as Atomwaffen and the Base, a group which is literally named after the translation of Al-Qaeda.
Yeah, and I think that this is interesting in light of some of the editing that happened of that interview, because almost immediately after you two were interviewed, both of you made very clear answers to those claims that someone in the center might say, well, you're just as extreme. Both of you answered very explicitly and very clearly, saying that, yes, but what's very different about us is that we are a defensive organization. No leftists in the SRA have a hit list going of people that we need to snipe, of buildings that we need to bomb. Certainly not as SRA members. We in the SRA are focused on community defense. We're trying to keep ourselves alive. We're trying to defend ourselves from people like this. That's the problem with equating both sides, is that we're fighting for our right to even exist in this world, and right-wingers' goal is to hunt us down and prevent us from existing. That's an extremely important distinction to make, because when right-wingers go out to a gun range and they have pictures of people that they shoot, the reason that should make everybody uncomfortable is because those are real people. Those are real people who are just existing, doing their job. So let's talk about the difference between that and a representation of a KKK member. That's someone who has actively participated in the oppression of another group of people who are just existing. That's someone who has donned a uniform, has hidden their identity, and has probably murdered at least one person of a minority group simply because they exist. When we talk about shooting images of KKK members, we're talking about firing back at literal symbols of oppression that oppressors have donned themselves.
And it's worth noting that the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, is literally a terrorist group. They commit and have committed egregious acts of terrorism against black people, against Jews, against any group that they consider to be un-American or non-white or anti-white. There's really a very different context to, some right-wing nutjob shooting at a target of a stereotypical depiction of a Muslim versus someone who's a member of a minority group shooting at a target of a KKK member in robes with the hood pointing a gun at them. The point of it is that there's a very different context to members of minority groups practicing on targets of representations of actual domestic terrorist groups like the Klan versus members of the Klan shooting at targets of stereotypical representations of minority groups.
Yeah, I think that this in some ways speaks to the pervasiveness of right-wing talking points, that you can say things like Blue Lives Matter and underneath a KKK robe, a person is still a person. They want you to think as much as possible that being a police officer, that being a KKK member is just as inherent and just as much a choice as it is to be a member of a minority group.
They only assign moral responsibility to the victims in a situation or to the disadvantaged group as opposed to the people who actually have power. With great power comes great responsibility. If a middle class and wealthy people in this country are the people who have power in our society, therefore the greater burden of moral responsibility lies on their shoulders, especially when they commit acts of literal terrorism, as opposed to resting on the shoulders of black people, of queer people, of members of any disadvantaged group in this country. So I really hate this sort of disingenuous, pathological obsession with this dual polarity that if one side is bad, the other must be equally as bad. The right wing has groups like Atomwaffen and the Base, literal white supremacist terrorist organizations which have committed terrorist attacks in the past 2 years. You look at the scariest, most extreme radical groups on the left. You have us, the SRA, teaching people how to shoot guns for self-defense responsibly, legally, through the structure of a non-profit organization. You have groups like Redneck Revolt and Huey P. Newton gun clubs who will sometimes go out and open carry in states where it is legal only as a presence to counter right-wing groups who show up and protest about how they don't like Muslims while carrying assault rifles. I think there's a pretty clear difference there. I think there's a pretty strong differentiation between actual terrorists and people who are just willing to go out and counter-protest legally. And I think that sort of equivocation that liberals like to play, and especially that we saw with the BBC. Again, I don't want to hate on the BBC, but I just want to say that what we saw is extremely typical of the sort of liberal ideology that suffuses so much of our media and that gives cover to right-wing extremists. And speaking of media giving cover to far-right groups, Fox News lately has been giving cover to extreme right perspectives again. So recently, Jeanine Pirro gave a little, I don't know, what's halfway between a dog whistle and an outright statement of white supremacy? What would you call that?
A Trump, a 2016. She was 2016ing it. Let's do that.
Jeanine Pirro suggested that because Congresswoman Ilhan Omar wears a hijab, that means that she must have some sort of dual loyalty, that she must have some sort of loyalty to Sharia law, which is just the same sort of thinly veiled, if it's even veiled at all, racism that was used against Barack Obama for wearing traditional African garb in a photo, that's been used against Muslims in America for decades, ever since the 9/11 attacks. This sort of painting Muslims as not being fully American, as not being truly loyal to American, as somehow having some sort of subversive belief in overthrowing America and instituting Islamic law. And obviously that's complete bullshit, because Ilhan Omar is one of the most progressive people in the House of Representatives.
Yeah, I think it kind of feeds into the perception that right-wing people want you to have of those groups, that they are just naturally inclined towards violence and terrorism and things like that. It's the exact same way that they talk about black people, that they talk about, lots of people from Latin America. They really want you to think that they choose to be this way, that people just choose to commit crimes, they choose to oppress their women, they choose to silently endorse ISIS, and they choose to enact Sharia law and stuff because they're just evil. They're just evil inherently, and that's just the way that things are.
And of course, spreading that sort of rhetoric, which essentially dehumanizes people and removes their moral agency and paints them as being merely representatives of the larger culture that they come from, that's the exact sort of rhetoric that is used to spread hate, that does lead to extremism, that has led to extremism over the last several decades of right-wing media poisoning, and the way that liberal media just sort of toothlessly accedes to this point of view and just argues with it like it's any sort of good faith argument. This sort of rhetoric is what has led to groups like the far right, like Oath Keepers, like Three Percenters, these groups who feel like the mere presence of Muslims and Mexicans in America somehow means that America is under attack, that they have to defend America and the Constitution against the people who live here and work here side by side with these right-wingers as their neighbors. There's such a sense of paranoia instilled in these people by the media distortion of what people actually are, and by the bad faith sort of way that they handle matters of racial and religious identity of anyone who isn't a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, although Catholics are now honorarily in the club as well. But I have to say that I'm really proud of Ilhan Omar. I think that she has done a fantastic job so far in Congress. She wasn't on my radar initially as much as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Rashida Tlaib, but over the past couple months, Ilhan Omar has just been a firebrand of progressive and leftist rhetoric and ideas, putting these into the mainstream discussion in a way that even Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez hasn't quite been able to match. For starters, I loved the way that she ripped into that scumbag Elliot Abrams at the congressional hearing last month. If you aren't familiar with Elliot Abrams, he is one of the architects of Iran-Contra. He is involved in numerous operations to smuggle guns to fascists and right-wing death squads in Latin America. And he's also currently Trump's special envoy to Venezuela and was involved in the attempts to smuggle weapons into Venezuela under the guise of humanitarian aid, which we'll get to in a moment. Ilhan Omar, during a congressional hearing, straight up called him out on his participation and support for actual war crimes and for massacres committed by right-wing forces in Nicaragua and El Salvador. Specifically the El Mozote massacre, where over 500 women and children were killed by right-wing death squads armed with U.S. weaponry. She straight up called this guy out as literally supporting this massacre, and it was just really good to see such a slimy scumbag get rattled on being called out in that way. It was really heartening to see that.
Yeah, it's almost unnerving to hear someone speak who actually represents things that you really do believe, like her extremely valid criticisms of Israel that all of Congress just couldn't wait to condemn her for saying. They just couldn't wait to tell her that she was being anti-Semitic by criticizing a legitimate fascist regime in Israel.
And it's especially noteworthy that literally a group advocating for an ethno-state has literally partnered with this far-right party to establish a majority government, rather than even accept the possibility that liberals might have some ability to slow down Likud apartheid programs in Israel. It's something that's unacknowledged by liberals, but many more leftists are becoming aware of it, is the way that Israel and the right-wing parties in Israel and people like Netanyahu are more than willing to work with actual fascists and actual anti-Semites in order to get their support for Israel, because ultimately their goal is to encourage more Jews to move to Israel. And Nazis and fascists in Europe and America want Jews to get out of their country. So it's sort of a natural alliance for these people to try to encourage Jews to flee Nazism and fascism in their home countries and move to Israel and become a part of the settler colonialist project there. So there's this sort of unholy partnership going on between Likud and between far-right anti-Semites. And so a lot of the criticism that is leveled at Israel currently is labeled disingenuously as being anti-Semitic by right-wing Israelis and by right-wing Zionists, rather than acknowledge the actual anti-Semitism that is coming from groups like, say, the Republican Party, which are filled with actual anti-Semites who want Jews to leave America and go to Israel. And this sort of endorsement for neo-Nazis that we get from people like Donald Trump.
Yeah, it is kind of funny to see those two groups like realize how much they have in common. Like, you want to shoot civilians, we want to shoot civilians. You want an ethno-state, we want an ethno-state. Like, we're such clear friends.
Yeah, and you have this sort of alliance between the military-industrial complexes and the police industries of each of these countries. So many American military personnel and so many American police go to Israel to train in crowd control, to train in advanced weaponry under the watch of the IDF, literally observing the apartheid techniques, literally looking at the walls and the surveillance and the brutal oppression that the IDF uses against Palestinians. Our police and our military is going over there and watching that and saying, you guys are pretty good at this. Can you give us some pointers? Hey, maybe you can test out some weapons for us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you can really see it with how much of an occupying force the police are in a lot of neighborhoods right now. How just like Israeli forces are never prosecuted, are never publicly criticized or made to answer for executing civilians, for firing on civilians, on peaceful protesters, just like American police officers are never made to answer for summary execution of any person of color or white people too. Let's not forget about Daniel Shaver. American police can execute civilians with the exact same impunity that Israeli forces can execute citizens of Gaza. So, not to make a both sides argument, but it does seem to apply here that they really do have a lot in common.
Yeah, and what we've been talking about is really sort of radical criticism and leftist criticism of Israel. The sort of things that we're saying, Ilhan Omar hasn't even really gone that far. She just criticized the lobbying influence that groups like AIPAC have in the United States, the lobby dollars that they throw around, the sort of silencing effect that they have on people who criticize Israeli policy and the U.S.-Israeli relationship. Even that sort of mild criticism of the undue influence that AIPAC has in America, even that resulted in congressmen who have received money from AIPAC viciously attacking Ilhan Omar rhetorically. I've heard mixed results. Some Jewish leftists I've talked to said that it sounded kind of dog whistly. Others say that it wasn't. Trying to paint these probably accidental poor wordings and trying to paint that as Ilhan Omar being some sort of radical anti-Semite, which is something that they can really only get away with because she is a black Muslim, because she is a woman of color and doesn't have the institutional force behind her that a white man might have if he were to make that criticism, or especially if someone like, say, Bernie Sanders was to level that criticism as a Jewish man himself. By using these sort of disingenuous arguments against Ilhan Omar and using her faith and using her background to paint her as some anti-Semitic extremist, for a brief period they were able to create this narrative in the media that Ilhan was some sort of vicious bigot. But I think there's been a bit of a sea change over the past several months, and I think that in this particular controversy, I think Ilhan Omar came out on top in the end.
Mm-hmm. She absolutely did. The pressure from the public in general saying, like, yeah, I don't know. It sure sounds like she was making some valid points there. Force this rebuke to tone down its language and not say explicitly that, she was being anti-Semitic and stuff. It forced them to decry bigotry in general. Now, they sure should have done that a real fucking long time ago. Certainly in the last few years with open white nationalists running for the House fairly regularly.
Steve King.
Yeah. So they're more than happy to condemn bigotry when it's leveled at their donors. But if it's just bigotry against everyone who isn't white, then they're kind of like, yeah, but we're all white, or we're mostly white. Yeah, you shouldn't say that, certainly in public. It's one thing to like enact numerous policies that uphold that and stuff, but you shouldn't at least you shouldn't say things like that.
I think it's worth noting an article by The Guardian that investigated whether or not AI PAC donations had an influence on whether or not a specific congressman would condemn or have a strong stance against Ilhan Omar. And what they found was that the more money someone received from AI PAC, the more likely they were to strongly condemn Omar's statements against AI PAC, and the more likely they were to try to paint Omar as an anti-Semite. To quote from the article, presidential candidates who received significantly more money from the pro-Israel lobby include Senator Cory Booker, who called Omar's comments, quote, disturbing. He received $445,000 during his Senate campaign, while Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, who has received about $367,000, said criticisms of Israel should be made, quote, without employing anti-Semitic tropes about money or influence. On the contrary, Democratic presidential candidates such as Bernie Sanders, Kamala Harris, and Elizabeth Warren, who've received relatively little money from the pro-Israel lobby, tended to be more likely to issue statements in support of Omar. Sanders received $16,000 over his whole career, which, considering that he's basically a living fossil, is incredible. Warren has received around $107,000, or about $53,000 per campaign, and Harris received about $41,000, and all of these people made statements in support of Omar. And there are more figures throughout the article to that effect, but essentially the politicians who received the most money from AI PAC were the most likely to attack Ilhan Omar for criticizing AI PAC, which I think pretty much exactly proves her point, exactly like nail on the head.
Yeah. I don't know. It sure sounds like a coincidence to me. Yeah, like who knows why they feel the need to call her out as being anti-Semitic.
And aside from that, she is really just hitting all the buttons of the mainstream political circus of the last several decades. In fact, she's actually questioned U.S. attempts at regime change in Venezuela. She actually said that Trump is lying about the Venezuela crisis and that Americans need to question the narratives that are being spread, which is frankly astonishing. Even Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez hasn't gone that far. Omar so far is the most anti-imperialist voice. So if you've been following the SRA homepage, we did put out a statement condemning the attempted coup in Venezuela. Now, we did actually get some feedback from people who were upset that we made a political statement that wasn't related to guns or assault for community defense directly. I do want to say that we are a leftist organization and we don't want to step into every anti-imperialist movement. There's a lot of imperialism to go around, and SRA wants to focus on other things. But when it came to Venezuela specifically, just the bald-faced nature of that coup and the fact that we have people like Marco Rubio in Florida actively pushing for a military intervention, we felt it was necessary to put out a statement directly condemning the attempted coup in Venezuela. As has been known for a while by people on the left, but is finally starting to be acknowledged by liberal media, the events in Venezuela are so obviously orchestrated. It cannot be overstated how clear it is that every aspect of this political crisis in Venezuela has been directed by the U.S. and has been done to construct a narrative to justify the ousting of Maduro.
It completely legitimizes all of the historical criticisms that have been leveled at the U.S. for its imperialism, for its unnecessary interventionism, all of the accusations that leftists have been making for a long time about the way that the U.S. manufactures crises, the way that it only pays attention to certain human rights abuses if it legitimizes some kind of invasion for an economic resource. It completely legitimizes all of those claims because we have the internet, because we're connected, because we have people actively visiting Venezuela and saying things like, things really didn't seem that bad there. Things almost seem worse in some American cities. And also you have the media saying things like, oh, the Maduro's people set fire to an aid convoy. They don't even want aid and stuff, when it turns out that it was actually, according to video footage, it was actually opposition people who lit the aid convoy on fire accidentally. So, try as they might to manufacture any kind of crisis that everyone can get behind so that we can justify sending troops, sending bombs, doing an actual forcible coup now that Guaido's attempt was so, hilariously inept.
There's been several articles that have come out, and no mainstream media sources have sort of tied these threads together yet. But if you do some research, you can find that actually the story of how the coup happened and how it unfolded is kind of amazing. So the Wall Street Journal, so this is liberal mainstream media, immediately after the U.S. declared support for Guaido, apparently Wall Street Journal and people in the State Department assumed that the coup would be over quickly and that Guaido would take control of the country. And so they took some time out of their schedule to gloat. So apparently Juan Guaido was handpicked by agents at the U.S. Embassy as the best option for a opposition leader to challenge Maduro. He was contacted by the U.S. Embassy, went to the embassy, and was asked if he would like to lead a movement to oust Maduro, and he said yes. He allegedly spoke to Mike Pence on the phone and discussed plans for how the coup would unfold. And tying in some reports from a Brazilian newspaper, which had some rather startling revelations, apparently Guaido promised Mike Pence that if the U.S. and other countries backed Guaido's claim to be president of Venezuela, that Guaido could ensure that at least 50% of Venezuela's military would join him and oppose Maduro. As it turned out, the number of soldiers willing to defect and oppose Maduro was about 200 out of several 100,000. And so Guaido first tried to contact Venezuelan army officers over social media, asking them to defect and join his cause. None of them did. After that, apparently he hit up wealthy Venezuelan exiles in the United States asking for money with which he could bribe Venezuelan army officers and soldiers to join his cause, and apparently they didn't want to pay up. Apparently they were a bit too stingy for him to be able to afford sufficient bribes to make that happen.
That's so weird. It's almost like public support for Maduro vastly outweighs opposition support for getting rid of him. That's so weird.
I mean, it's not like people like Maduro. I mean, he's no Chavez, and even Chavez had problems. But I think it's pretty obvious that Guaido's only game plan is to overthrow Maduro so that he can take control of Venezuela's oil refineries and oil extraction operations, privatize them, and sell them to ExxonMobil in exchange for U.S. support for his political project. And considering that Venezuela's social programs and social welfare net is almost completely funded by oil revenues, that would mean essentially completely removing all socialist or social democratic policies in the country of Venezuela and simply doing essentially capitalist shock therapy like happened to the USSR after the coup against Gorbachev. We all saw how that turned out.
Yeah, it is shocking how blatant it is, how obvious it is, but it is heartening to see how universally so many leftist groups have said that this is wrong, this is evil, it's extremely precedented, and that we have to do everything in our power to make sure that things like this no longer happen. And I think that we should expect that representatives say the same. I think that we should hold representatives to that standard as well and expect that they not be imperialists either.
Exactly. We need people in our government who have at least some semblance of moral clarity to say that, hey, it's not our place to go around dictating to other countries how their government should be run. I mean, unless you actually have outright fascism and outright genocide, I don't think that there's any justification for the U.S. to go around sponsoring regime change, especially when most of the regimes that America seems to think need to change are countries that have large amounts of oil or other natural resources that American companies would like to exploit.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I'd like to reiterate, talking about anti-imperialism, people tend to associate that with certain left-wing tendencies. I just want to say that I am a libertarian communist. And when I look at Venezuela, that's not the model of socialism that I envision. That's not the goal that I'm fighting for. And I don't think Maduro is a great or perfect leader. But just because he isn't a great leader, just because Venezuela isn't the socialism that we would like to see necessarily, doesn't mean that we can't take a stand and say, hey, let's not go in there. Let's not sponsor this coup. Let's not take place in destabilizing this country for the enrichment of private industry. I think it's worthwhile for leftists to take a stand and, stand in solidarity with other socialists who we might have political disagreements with about how society should be organized, and at least be able to say, hey, hands off Venezuela. This isn't our place. This isn't our fight. America should not be involved in overthrowing Latin American countries for its own benefit. And I think that it should be an easy choice to be able to condemn this sort of coup and to condemn the actions that America has taken with regards to Venezuela in the last several months, because frankly, it's completely insane.
Yeah, that's definitely true. I think that it's a fundamental basis of leftist ideology in general that we believe that people should have a say in their government. They should have a say in their workplace. They should have a say in their lives. And I think that we all can agree, as leftists of many different stripes, that the United States invading your country and deposing a leader that you democratically elected, that's the opposite of you having a say in your government and you having a say in your life and in your circumstances.
So I do want to say that if you do want to take additional action beyond, simply talking about this and talking to your comrades and your friends and your family about why we should not intervene in Venezuela, if you want to go a bit further and take part in an actual action opposing the U.S. coup, there is an event happening on March 16th, the U.S. Hands Off Venezuela protest, which is organized by the Answer Coalition, which is a partner of the Party for Socialism and Liberation and of the Workers' World Party, just so you're aware of their affiliations. If you want to take part in that protest to decry U.S. involvement in Latin America, and you can get to the White House in time for this protest, then I highly recommend taking part. I think it's a worthy cause. Or if you're, maybe a bit more interested in a hands-off approach to this, Code Pink, which is a woman-led anti-war organization, is also running a petition condemning the U.S. coup. No U.S. intervention in Venezuela. You can look up Code Pink's website and sign their petition on there. They've already got several thousand signatures, but they could absolutely use with a few more. So, yeah, hands off Venezuela. Don't listen to obvious lies in mainstream media, especially with regards now to the disruptions to Venezuela's electric grid in the past week. Possibly maybe Venezuela's largest power plant shut down coincidentally during the middle of a coup, but frankly the timing seems a bit suspicious to me. So I think it's clear that imperialist efforts are ongoing in the region.
And it is funny to see someone like Marco Rubio bring up, like, wow, this is Venezuela's 45th hour without power. Truly, this country is in dire need of our help. It's like and then there was that post that responded to him saying, like, Puerto Rico was without power for, 11 months. And that's a U.S. state.
Well, U.S. territory at any rate.
That's a U.S. territory.
Yeah, well, I don't think Marco Rubio cares about any Latin American person who isn't a wealthy Cuban, so I guess that doesn't really count in his books.
No. You can see where his priorities are at. All right, so we've talked before on the show about home defense and defending yourself and all that kind of stuff, and there are a lot of calibers for guns out there, and I'm curious what your thoughts are on what calibers are best suited for defending yourself. There's a lot of talk of certain calibers being too weak and being unable to stop a person. As soon as you start talking about handgun calibers or anything else, people start talking about stopping power and all of that kind of stuff. And I'm just kind of curious what where that line is of this caliber will be able to defend you and this caliber will not in a defense kind of situation.
So there's a lot of misinformation out there. There's a lot of what I would call gun lore, where, it's this sort of accepted narrative about what guns are viable or not viable, or what guns are cool or not cool, or what calibers are man stoppers and which calibers are not. And oftentimes there's a grain of truth to this lore, but a lot of it, frankly, is bullshit. With regards to handgun calibers in particular, generally you can classify handgun calibers into 3 categories. Low power cartridges like 22 long rifle, 25 ACP, and 32 ACP. medium power, standard power cartridges like 9mm, 45, 38 special. And then you have sort of Magnum cartridges like 357 Magnum, 357 SIG, 44 Magnum, amped up sort of cartridges. The most common handgun caliber for self-defense, the one that I think most people carry and that most police departments and militaries have standardized on, is the 9mm. And I just want to say that right off the bat, in terms of a defensive handgun, I'm going to say that in most situations, 9mm is the best choice because it is the most common. It's standard. There are very good projectiles for it. You can get really good ammo. The ammo is cheap. You can practice with it a lot. All the kinks have been worked out. However, there's this sort of machismo element to gun culture, especially on the right, of course, where people don't want the standard. They want something that's a little bit stronger, something with stopping power, something knock a man off his feet in one shot.
Something that says I almost went pro, but my knee blew out, or I could probably lift a car in the right situation.
Yeah, totally. Or even just, I have a big dick and a gun to match.
Yeah, for sure.
So you get this sort of thing where people say, 9mm, that's it's a wimpy cartridge that can't stop someone. What you really want is a 45 or a 40 Smith & Wesson or 357 Magnum. I don't want to denigrate these cartridges and say that they're bad or useless or something, because they're not. They do have their applications. If no other reason, then there are a lot of historical guns in these cartridges that are cool and fun to shoot. Shooting big guns can be a lot of fun. I recommend it. But in terms of what's practical for self-defense or home defense, what it really comes down to is you need to look at the numbers and, how effective a gun or a specific caliber actually is at preventing someone from killing you. So there's been a number of different attempts to sort of measure the effectiveness of different cartridges over the years. One of the more recent ones was an accumulation of data put together by a guy named Greg Elefritz, where he took track of all reported incidents of defensive handgun use in police contexts, self-defense situations, anything that he could find reported. And he compiled as much data as he could about what guns and what cartridges were used, how many rounds were fired, how many rounds it took to incapacitate someone, what percentage of attackers were incapacitated or not incapacitated, the accuracy, the one-stop shot rate, and such. And he put together a really quite impressive data set that I think is very useful. And so conveying all this over an audio format can be a little bit difficult. If you want to look at the actual numbers, I recommend looking up Greg Elefritz and looking at his data yourself. But essentially, the results of this data were that a lot of the data that he collected turned out to be almost completely random with relation to the caliber of the firearm used. The average number of rounds until incapacitation was almost random with regards to caliber. The one-stop shot rate mostly fell within the same range for all handguns, except for 44 Magnum, which did outpace the pack in that regard, but notably 357 Magnum and other similar rounds did not. Interestingly, the only statistic that really correlated with caliber was the percent of people who were not incapacitated by being shot, the number of people who were shot by a particular cartridge and were able to keep going and keep fighting. The data that Greg found was that for all of the common medium power defensive rounds, 380 ACP, 38 Special, 9mm Luger, 357, 40 Smith & Wesson, 45 ACP, and 44 Magnum, approximately 10 to 20% of attackers were not incapacitated by being shot with those cartridges. On the other hand, small compact pistol cartridges like 25 ACP, 22 long rifle, and 32 ACP, in those cases, approximately 30 to 40% of people were not incapacitated. So it does seem that there is a cliff in that data where very small rounds like 25 and 32 caliber have a lower chance of actually stopping an attacker. But once you get into the mainstream, medium power cartridges, and even into the Magnum cartridges, pretty much everything has about an equal chance of stopping the person who's attacking you. And it doesn't matter how big of a bullet you're throwing. It doesn't matter really how fast it's going. As long as you have a big enough gun, it doesn't really matter how much bigger it is than that. The exception, of course, is once you go beyond handgun cartridges and you go into the realm of rifles and shotguns, where the difference in power is in order of magnitude greater than any handgun can realistically put out. Rifles and shotguns tend to have, much higher lethality, much higher rate of instant one-shot stops, much lower rates of non-incapacitation. So rifles are rifles and pistols are pistols. And as long as you have a good enough cartridge, it doesn't matter. You don't need to be throwing around some 230 grain 45 caliber baseball to stop an attacker.
The police certainly know that multiple 9mm, fired into like a really big threat, like a sleeping person or like some madman holding a cell phone, or, into someone who's like already handcuffed. That'll definitely stop the most determined attackers, such as those.
Yeah, absolutely. I do want to mention that the small calibers, 25, 32, the 22 long rifles, even though these did perform noticeably worse than the medium power and full power like Magnum handgun cartridges, the small calibers were not useless for self-defense. These cartridges will kill someone. They will stop someone if you hit them in a vital place. It's just that, once you get small enough, you start not seeing effects like bullet tumbling or bullet expansion anymore with like a hollow point round or something. Once you get down to those very small cartridges, you're really just poking holes in people, and you're not going to stop them unless that hole goes through something important. So they're not as effective, but if you shoot someone 5 times with a 22, they're probably going to stop. So these cartridges aren't ideal for self-defense. They're not, I wouldn't recommend them, but if that's all you have, it's certainly better than having nothing.
That makes sense.
So if you're looking for a defensive handgun, I recommend a 9mm, just because, you're going to do as well with a 9mm as you will with anything else, and it's a lot cheaper to shoot, and there's a lot more availability of ammo and nice hollow points available for it. So standard recommendation would be 9mm. If you're looking for a compact pistol, something smaller, 380 ACP is very viable. There are very nice compact 380s. And of course, also there are compact revolvers in 38 Special, or cartridges like 32 Magnum or 327 Federal Magnum. Those weren't included in the statistics that Greg Alifritz put together, but those also do well in ballistic gel tests and would also probably be effective for self-defense. So get a 9mm. If you want something smaller, 380 or a similar cartridge, you don't need a Magnum. You don't need a 45. You don't need a 40 Smith & Wesson. You can make do with a 9mm. It's the standard for a reason, and it's really what you should be standardizing on if you want a practical gun for self-defense.
Yeah, if you're not fighting honey badgers like in a tunnel, you probably don't need a 45. But it would be cool to have.
Absolutely. Nothing better than going to the range with an old 1911. It may not be practical, but it's a lot of fun. All right, folks, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to have a brief interview with Angie Speaks, an anarchist YouTuber from the UK, who focuses on issue of culture, society, witchcraft, and identity. In the meantime, please enjoy this soothing ambient track by transgender artist Allison. You can find her Bandcamp at softspheres.bandcamp.com, and you can follow her on Twitter at 6gramstar. Welcome back, folks. This week we're speaking with Angie, a leftist YouTuber whose videos focus on issues relating to cultural analysis and social theory. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I was excited to be asked. My channel's name is Angie Speaks. I am an anarchist, and a lot of the videos I do focus on things like psychology, spirituality, art, all of the subjective sides, I guess, of human existence. So it's not like a super theory-based kind of material analysis focused kind of thing that I do. It's more of a using the material analysis and theory to speak to the more kind of subjective areas of human life. So that's kind of the ethos behind what I do.
So what brought you into leftist politics? Why do you choose to focus on the sorts of topics that you do?
So it was actually spirituality that brought me into leftist politics, because I started to kind of notice as I got into my mid-20s and stuff, the amount of pressure and stress that capitalism puts on everybody, and how it makes it almost impossible to pursue any kind of spiritual life or spiritual goals because of the sheer disconnection, alienation, all of those things. So I kind of see the goals of anti-capitalism as being really like linked to the goals of a lot of different spiritual traditions in terms of like liberating the human spirit and giving us the opportunity to really kind of individuate and be all that we can be. I couldn't reconcile being a spiritual person with also being pro-capitalist, so that was the rabbit hole that like led me down the leftist trajectory.
And what led you into making YouTube videos specifically? How did you get into the sort of breadtube space?
So I had been like a spectator for a while. There were like a few channels that were on my radar, and I just kind of fell down the rabbit hole in that way. I know Peter Coffin was one of the first breadtube channels. Kevin Logan, like loads of people like that were the ones that I first started watching. But the thing that made me decide to join the conversation was, again, like feeling like those subjective areas of life can sometimes like go unnoticed or untalked about on the left, and I felt like it was important to some kind of bring that back into the fold and give the left, I guess, a soul. Because like when it comes to, you know, material analysis and things like that, we're great with that kind of thing. But if we only focus on material needs, I feel like we're just kind of creating new forms of alienation if we're not paying key attention to how the material also affects the immaterial and the subjective. And that's kind of been a huge kind of issue within the history of leftist politics, of that side of life kind of going unnoticed or uncurated too, I guess. So that kind of leaves us vulnerable in a lot of different ways.
Definitely, and I do think it's really important for leftists to be able to speak to the more, you know, spiritual side of humanity, especially because the goal of socialist or anarchist organizing really is to free people from the like material restrictions and bondage they're placed under capitalism. Being able to reach out, especially with movements like the Weird Lefts. Yeah. You know, I'm not necessarily a believer in anything like that, but I think that's a very important thing for people to pursue.
Yeah, I mean, the Weird Left isn't really like, it's not as much of a thing as it could be. Like, there are leftists who are subscribe to some form of spirituality, but it's not like it's an organized thing or kind of just sort of loose alliances in that regard. But there are like a lot of really interesting things coming out of leftists that have spiritual practices. Like, I know that Gods and Radicals is a publication that has been really like amazing and eye-opening to me, and all kinds of things that are occurring now that spiritual people are starting to sort of adopt leftist politics. I think that if the left kind of opens its doors to us and remains open-minded about what it is that we're trying to do / what it is that we're trying to be, which is just kind of really the soul, I think that we could see some really interesting things occur for me, spirituality isn't really about adopting a specific paradigm or adopting some kind of practice. It's all about self-actualization and paying attention to those subjective areas of life. And I think that's something that's useful for everybody, regardless of belief or lack thereof.
Absolutely. So in addition to discussions about spirituality, you also talk quite a bit about topics and ideas like social capital. Can you describe what social capital is and how its accumulation and exchange affects leftist politics?
Well, okay, I guess we'll start with the first half of the question. This is a topic that's obviously been floating around the leftist zeitgeist at the moment. I don't think I necessarily started it off. I think it was always there. I think I just added a ton of gasoline to that fire. But everybody, one of the things that I noticed is that everybody sort of has their own different meaning about what social capital is. I guess I could only speak about what I think it is from my perspective. I think that social capital sort of functions in the same way as material capital, but just in the social sphere. So I guess the least abstract example I can give of social capital is clout. It's clout and influence, basically, which are two new kind of metrics. Well, they're not new, but they're more accessible now to the average person now that there's the internet. And in leftist circles, accumulation of social capital can be done in many different ways. If we're speaking specifically on the internet, you can accumulate social capital by having a good take, or making a good video, or doing a good analysis of something. You can also accumulate social capital in other less, I guess, innocuous ways. And then there are also ways to accumulate social capital in dangerous ways. But the main metric that leads towards the accumulation of social capital is attention. And then that attention then can turn into kind of clout or influence, depending on how much you're able to accumulate. So that's the accumulation part. And how I think it affects leftist politics, well, I think in a lot of different ways. I think it creates a hierarchy, because those with more social capital, when it comes to what is considered valid and valuable, those with more social capital are usually taken more seriously than those with less. Even though somebody with less social capital might be saying something really valuable or useful or interesting or important, it's quite difficult because it creates a hierarchy. And I feel like the left doesn't do enough to examine those hierarchies. They just kind of start to form, and nobody really thinks critically about them or does the intellectual labor it takes to like unpick how that may be influencing our behavior or how we treat each other. So I guess that's why I talk about it, because I find it interesting, number one, and also because I don't like it when things just kind of form on their own without people consciously examining them. Like, we're leftists. We claim to want to build a new society without perpetuating the inequalities of what we experience on a day-to-day basis in the world under capitalism. Yeah, when we form our own circles, elements of the old system kind of seem to follow us, and we just play by those rules and we don't really question it. And then when bad things happen or toxic elements of our community arise, we just kind of are dumbfounded by it. And it's something I've seen happen time and time again.
One of the more concrete examples of social capital is social media and social media engagement. Other YouTubers and leftist thinkers have talked about the ways that social media sort of quantifies social capital in terms of likes and shares and views and follows.
Yeah.
How do you think social media affects leftist discourse, and do you think it's overall beneficial or harmful to our political projects?
I think it depends. I think it all kind of boils down to like consciousness. I think at the moment it is kind of acting in a harmful way in certain areas because nobody is doing enough to consciously examine how these things affect our behavior and the way we behave and interact with each other and all those things. In some senses it can be good, obviously, and we see that happen all the time in terms of issues that are important getting attention, or people really being able to make a difference in each other's lives through putting people who are in need in the spotlight. These are all, I guess, good uses of the system as it is, but I worry that because of the metrics like likes and the things that accumulate the most attention, we place subconsciously more importance on those things, and just because something has a shit ton of likes doesn't mean that it's necessarily the most important thing, or just because somebody has a shit ton of social capital doesn't necessarily mean that they're always right, or that they necessarily are completely perpetually correct on everything. So in that sense, it can be harmful. Cults of personality can form easily. People can, use these metrics cynically. There are a lot of problems that do arise, and I think that it's something that we should be conscious about and have conversations about.
So one example of that I've seen in the activism that I pursue is the way that social media sort of encourages certain forms of content to become popular and go viral and suppresses other forms. For instance, I often try to use SRA social media accounts to highlight local activism that's going on or the struggles of indigenous communities or other groups. These get some attention. A few people like it, a few people see it or share it. But if I really wanted to get a lot of social capital, if I really wanted a lot of likes and follows, platforms like Twitter really encourage things like dunking on right-wingers, something which is fun and splashy, but doesn't necessarily help the movement.
Yeah, definitely. These systems sort of encourage a form of sensationalism. They also kind of encourage us to participate in spectacle and performativity as well, which is also an issue because at the end of the day, the main function of these platforms is to accumulate attention. And then that attention then turns into social capital. It doesn't always, but it can easily stop being about how to best get a message across or how best to aid in a certain situation. It kind of sometimes boils down to how can I get the most attention in the quickest way possible. And the easiest way to do that is to appeal to people's visceral emotions, whether that be outrage, anger, all of those things. So you see leftist circles online oftentimes playing out those dynamics that are put before us by capital without really consciously examining them. Especially when it comes to outrage culture. Outrage culture is so lucrative. And there are many cynical people and cynical entities who may be consciously doing it or unconsciously doing it. It's not always best to tell. All we can do is kind of speculate. But people know that outrage is lucrative, and the last couple of years have been, really full of outrage. 2 years ago, it was traumatic to be on social media because every day there was a new video of a black person being brutalized by police. So that was the sort of trend back then, was us, seeing these really visceral, awful things. And obviously a lot of trauma would result from that. Now, the trend in the media is sex scandals. Sex scandals seem to be the thing that are making the rounds now. Again, kind of extracting these visceral kind of emotions from us. And, I sit and think about it because I think, like, obviously, like, fuck, I'm anti-capitalist. Even to the point where sometimes it feels like I'm wearing a tinfoil hat around. And I think, like, is this by design, or is it just the ugly underbelly of society being exposed, and now we have the tools that are exposing it, that make it easier to expose it? Because outrage is also lucrative under capitalism. So it's kind of impossible to really tell what's going on. But we can look at how the money is made, where the attention goes. I always think the best thing to do when trying to unpick any kind of messy situation is to follow the capital, whether it be social or material capital. Like, follow the capital, look at how it's behaving, and then maybe you'll be able to see the motives behind whatever it is that's going on.
So I guess the real question here is, knowing that these systems of social capital exist, is there a way for leftists to seize the means with regards to social capital? How can we build and use social capital constructively in a way that uplifts marginalized people and builds a movement towards societal change rather than using it destructively?
I'm asking myself this question all the time, and many better minds than me are also asking it. I've seen quite a few cases of people kind of subverting the system by using social capital that would be, accumulated towards them for any sort of specific reason, but then using that capital and passing it on to a marginalized community, or using that capital to highlight something outside of themselves, or giving it over to in the way that really needs it. And I think that the same way that we have a kind of socialist ethos when it comes to material capitalism, we should also have a more socialist kind of open ethos when it comes to social capitalism. Because the sort of greedy ways, the greedy, shitty ways that material capitalists behave would never fly on the left, but being a greedy social capitalist flies on the left. You can get away with being as ruthless and as conniving as you want with social capital on the left, because nobody's going to question it, because it's not a conversation that's really been brought into the fold when it comes to this sort of analysis. I mean, it's there, but it's just not as loud as other things. So I think as the conversation on social capital continues, there'll be more solutions that emerge. But personally, I try my best to share the social capital that I amass as much as possible. Because we're all on capitalist platforms as content creators, whether that be Twitter or Facebook or YouTube. We have to play the social capital game in one way or another, but I tend to try and share it as much as possible, which is kind of what I'm doing right now. But I think the more the conversation continues, the more people will be able to think of solutions collectively, which is what I'm more interested in. Nothing that I can really say on the matter individually really makes much of a difference.
What are some other voices that people could listen to for, the ongoing conversation on social capital?
I know that American Johnson from the channel Non-Compete talks about it. Peter Coffin talks about it. I know that Doug Lane from Zero Books talks about it. I know that Mark Fisher has also spoken about it. So I guess those are some places to start. Just generally, people are talking about it a lot at the moment. And if you want to start a conversation about it, whoever's listening out there, then, people are... It depends. I wouldn't say people are always open about talking about it, because it's kind of... That's the thing, it's a dangerous topic. Like I said, the same way talking about how shitty material capitalism would be a dangerous topic if you were talking to a bunch of bankers. Talking about social capital to a bunch of people, leftists on the internet who rely on these metrics, is also dangerous. So you may run into trouble if you decide to engage in these conversations, but it's still not, it's nothing ventured, nothing gained. I did it, so, I encourage people to have dangerous conversations.
Great. Well, I'd like to maybe change the subject to a subject that's maybe not lighter, but maybe a bit of a different focus. So the Socialist Rifle Association is an organization that promotes socialists and members of minority communities to own firearms for self and community defense. And so I was interested in your perspective on that. As a Black woman living in the United Kingdom, you probably have a very different perspective on gun ownership than most Americans do. Can you sort of talk about what your perspective would be on the armed left? Do you think that guns have a place in modern radical struggles?
Yeah, I'd love to answer that question. Just to preface it, I would like to say that I've lived in both countries, both the US and the UK. I was born in the UK, grew up here, went to high school in America when I was 14, graduated from high school and came back to the UK for uni, and have been here since I graduated from university. So I've seen kind of both sides of the pond and been exposed to gun culture, I guess, in America. And when I was younger and I first moved to the States, that was the first time I ever saw a gun in real life. And it was on a security guard. And I remember being just alarmed, like absolutely just alarmed by it. Like I was so shocked that that somebody had like a live gun. I'd never seen such a thing before. And I was also shocked at how normal it was as well. And then, you know, obviously back then I was just kind of a liberal. I didn't really think about armed proletariat struggle or anything like that. So I always kind of thought that we had it better on this side of the pond, obviously, because we don't have things like mass shootings. I mean, we have had terrorist attacks, but they're usually like people using vans to run people over or bombs and things like that. But in terms of mass shootings, like, we don't have that. That's not really a problem here. There's a massive issue with knife crime, especially in London, in poor parts of London, and especially when it comes to disenfranchised communities and neighborhoods. Knife crime is a huge issue. So even without guns, there's still crime. People still find a way to fuck each other over, you know. And it was quite different when I was in America, where, you know, pretty much everybody had access to a firearm. Everybody who was like over a certain age and had met the requirements could attain a firearm. But it didn't really strike me to challenge the liberal narrative around guns until I became a leftist and started to kind of look at historical things and, you know, really study the Black Panthers and different things like that. It's a completely different ball game in America because the proletariat there is armed, I guess, and the government is also armed. So armed struggle against the government is a lot more possible there than it is here. If I lived in America, I would definitely own a gun. I would definitely encourage leftists to arm themselves. In America, you have right-wing militias, white supremacists who have been stockpiling weapons for decades. Why should we be sitting ducks? One of the things that I talk about a lot on my channel is the idea of surrendered territory, and how whenever something becomes even slightly problematic, the left just kind of cedes that territory to the right, which is really misguided in my opinion. And I feel like guns is one of those major territories that the left has kind of ceded to the right. And these kinds of abandonment of territories that we make tend to leave us vulnerable. So I definitely think armed struggle is an important thing, especially in places where you have access to firearms in the US and things like that. But here it's much different because it's almost impossible to get a gun except through either incredibly illegal means that could put you in danger, or if you're a farmer, they give licenses out to people who own farms for very specific things. But the people who tend to have access to firearms are the very, very wealthy and, you know, the police, the military. And yeah, it does kind of make me uncomfortable thinking that if, you know, there's any kind of, every protest I've been to, I went to a protest quite recently and the police were heavily armed. It does make me uncomfortable to think that the state in this country has a complete monopoly on violence, considering the trajectory that our government is going down, and it's you know, very far right at the moment, incredibly nationalistic and nativistic. the idea of the government having the monopoly on violence does make me uncomfortable. It does make me feel like the proletariat here in that regard are vulnerable in ways that I guess the folks across the pond may not necessarily be. Struggle here wouldn't really be possible unless that something really drastic happened. Whereas in the places where firearms are more accessible, it's definitely something that I think should be encouraged.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for coming on our show. Before we sign off, are there any organizations, YouTube channels, books, podcasts, or other media that you'd like to recommend?
In terms of the social capital thing, I definitely think that Mark Fisher's Escape the Vampire Castle essay is definitely a good one to recommend. I always give Audible Anarchist a shout out for those who are new to leftism and may not have a lot of time to read. Audible Anarchist is a YouTube channel that does audio versions of a lot of really, really great leftist literature. So that's one that I definitely shout out for people who are looking to get more into theory and ideas and discussions. So those are the two things. Those are the two things that I would recommend based on this conversation.
Awesome. And if someone were to start watching your YouTube channel, Angie Speaks, what's a good video for someone to start on?
I guess the latest one, Social Capital Can Be a Clout Game. They're kind of like my babies. All the videos are my babies, so if you can, watch them all. But if you're just starting, then you can start with the latest one.
All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on and interviewing with us today. It was really great speaking with you.
No problem. It was lovely to be invited. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Solidarity forever.
Solidarity. Thank you.